Psychotherapist and professor of psychology Dr. Kirk Honda was featured in a podcast that delved into the topic of imaginary friends. And in this podcast, Dr. Honda makes it clear that imaginary friends are not evil or anything like that. In fact, it is typical of children to converse with figments of their imagination. It is normal and shouldn't be too concerning. It must be reassuring to hear that there's nothing wrong with your child. As Dr. Honda stated, it's normal and shouldn't cause any concern. You think this, and your mind is finally at ease, as you've been struggling to decide as to whether or not you should seek a therapist for your child. But then, one night, as you pass by your child's room, you hear him talking again with his imaginary friend. You walk away, as you now know that it's perfectly normal for children to do this. You ignore his pretended conversation with Mr. Howdy, his imaginary friend, who, according to your son, only comes out at night when everyone is asleep. As you walk away, you can hear his voice echo down the hall. But then, you stop. You are inches away from entering your room when another voice echoes across the hall. You then race to your child's room, as you're certain the voice came from there. You burst into his room, expecting to see somebody there with him, but instead, you find him alone. No one else is there, except your child. It is at this moment you remember what Dr. Honda stated later in the podcast, that even though it is common and normal to have imaginary friends, there are some instances of children having friends that are frightening. These so-called friends are disturbing, and sometimes dangerous. It is cases like these that baffle experts and cause concern among child psychologists. How could a child who's never seen a horror movie or anything within that genre come up with such a frightening friend? If what children see and experience serve as a basis for their imaginary constructs, then where on earth did they come up with such terrifying characters? One could say that these imaginary friends are simply that, a product of their imagination. These friends may be scary, based on their description, but that's entirely subjective. What may seem scary to us may not be so for a child. However, how can you explain those instances of children having imaginary friends with names such as Lucifer and Dead Cousin? If said children were never exposed to such names, then where did they come from? Unfortunately, the answer to that is unknown. Or so it seems. We may not have an explanation for such odd occurrences, but that doesn't mean we can't consider other theories that are beyond the realm of science. As you'll see in the following story, some of these imaginary friends might be more than just a product of a child's mind. This story, the story of Madison and her imaginary friend, is a personal story that has left Madison traumatized. To this day, Madison remains unsettled by the events that occurred when she was a child. Madison was 3 years old when this happened, and ever since then, this incident continues to haunt her. Needless to say, she does not like telling the story. At the age of 3, Madison had many friends. All of them, however, were imaginary. Yet there was something interesting about them. They came in pairs. Her very first set of imaginary playmates were Dana and Steve. Then her next set was Fraga and Kinga. And then lastly, boyfriend and girlfriend. As you can tell, Madison had many friends. Madison was popular. But then, one day, along came a new friend, Kellum. Unlike Madison's other friends, Kellum wasn't part of a pair. He came by himself and seemed much older. Kellum's face was all a blur. Madison can barely recall how he looked, His voice, however, was raspy, similar to that of an old man's. Although he was different, this didn't stop Madison from playing with him almost every single day. Now, imagine having a child who one day tells you that her new friend is an old man. Madison's mom didn't think much of this, as she chalked it up to Madison's naive imagination. Yet, little did she know that Madison's new friend would be the cause of something horrific, something so frightening that to this day, both Madison and her mom are haunted by. Kellum was a strange friend. There was something else about him that made him really different. Madison couldn't figure this out, as she was too young to realize this difference. However, one night, Madison finally realized what made Kellum so special. But unfortunately, how she found out has left her traumatized to this day. Multiple incidents have led to this night. It was only a matter of time before something big would happen, before Madison would experience something terrifying. At first, Kellum was nice, but over time, he began to show his true colors. Madison would often be irritated by Kellum, who would not leave her alone. He would constantly ask Madison to play with them, even though she's already told him many times that she didn't want to. It got to a point where she would wake up in the middle of the night and find Kellum by her bedside, asking if she wanted to play. She was eventually pushed to a point where she could no longer tolerate his incessant behavior. Madison was really irritated. She was so irritated that one day she went into a fury and shouted at Kellum, telling him that she no longer wanted to play with him. Surely, this would stop Kellum from ever bothering her again, she thought to herself. But this outburst had an unintended effect. Thinking that Kellum would finally leave her alone, he was now, more than ever, invasive and demanding. And the worst part about this new Kellum was that he looked different. It was a look that was very displeasing, to say the least. His face, that was now somewhat visible to Madison, was unlike anything she's ever seen. His eyes were sunken in, and his face was too skinny. It was a frightening sight for Madison, one that would keep her up at night. And it was during one of these sleepless nights that Madison realized what made him different. Madison was lying in bed, when all of a sudden, Kellum is at the side of her bed, standing over with a deep gaze in his eyes. There was an awful feeling in the pit of her stomach. She then asked what he wanted. Kellum, as usual, wanted to play. Madison, in response, said she didn't want to. But, after having said this, she could see in his face that her response did not sit well with him. He was upset, so upset that he does the unimaginable. Kellum leans in and grabs Madison by the wrist. Madison was paralyzed. She actually felt a hand wrap around her wrist. It was at this moment that Madison realized what made Kellum so special. Kellum wasn't imaginary at all. He was real, and he was out to get her. Madison finally lets out a piercing scream that wakes her mother up. Madison was inconsolable. She wouldn't stop crying. Her mother was confused, for she didn't know why Madison was acting up. But then, right before her eyes, Madison's mom saw the reason as to why Madison was so terrified. Across Madison's room were a pair of curtains that blew open. There was no wind. The AC was off and the window was shut. They opened up as if someone were hiding behind them and came running out of them after being spotted. It was at this point that Madison's mom figured that her daughter was in danger. All those times that Madison complained about Kellum were now seen in a different light. What was once thought to be a figment of her daughter's mind is now viewed as a real threat. They immediately left the house and stayed over at a relative's. The following day, she called her father-in-law, who happened to be a priest. She told him of what had happened, and without hesitation, he agreed to anoint their house. Madison's home was cleansed. They returned home, and Madison was never bothered again. Although Kellum is now gone, the trauma of Madison's experience is still with her to this day. It was only years later that Madison learned of something chilling about her home. After doing research on the history of her property, Madison learned that the house next to hers belonged to the Beasley family. And among the Beasleys, there was a father by the name of Callum Beasley. Callum. Does this sound familiar? Because if not, then let me remind you of Madison's imaginary friend, Kellum, whose name happens to sound a lot like Callum. Surely, a 3-year-old would mispronounce such a name. It is now clear as to why Madison doesn't like telling the story. It's unsettling and conjures up memories that are overwhelming. Aside from this reason, people might think she's crazy, but that's okay, as this prevents her from having to retell this triggering story. Yet, it's stories like these that are worth telling, as they make us wonder what lies beyond. Science may not have an answer to such peculiar cases, but at least stories like these can offer theories that may explain such oddities, theories that science wouldn't dare consider. Of course, these stories come at a cost. They leave us with a sense of fear. We become paranoid as we relate these stories to our own experiences. Perhaps we too had an imaginary friend that seemed a little too real to be fake. Maybe this so-called imaginary friend is still with us today. We just don't know it. And if he's a real good friend, then he most likely believes in the motto of staying friends till the end. A motto that I'm sure most of us would like our friends to follow. Now, who wouldn't want a friend like that? Thanks for watching, and until next time.